Three men stood at the edge of town like they had grown straight out of the mountain itself. Identical, 6 feet 5, shoulders broad enough to block the sun, and all six of those amber eyes were locked on the woman stepping off the stagecoach with nothing but a carpet bag and a dead mother's brooch. The letter had promised her one husband. It had not mentioned three, and it had not mentioned the woman they buried on the hill 8 years ago or how she died. This is that story. She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting with flowers or a nervous smile. No house in sight, not even the faint outline of one through the falling snow. Just a frozen street, a handful of tired buildings, and three bearded men standing at the edge of town like they had grown straight out of the mountain itself. Three men, not one. Three. Each one stood at least 6 feet and 5 inches tall, maybe taller. Their shoulders were broad enough to block the pale winter light behind them, and their bills were the kind that came not from vanity, but from years of splitting timber, hauling stone, and bending the wilderness to their will. They wore leather and denim and work boots caked with mountain mud. One had a dark brown vest hanging open despite the freezing air. Another wore a red bandana knotted at his throat. The third wore blue, but it was their faces that stopped Lena Prescott where she stood. They were identical. The same square jaw, the same chestnut brown hair sun-streaked and wind-tangled. The same unusual eyes, the color of whiskey held to firelight, amber and deep and burning with a something she could not name. And all six of those eyes were locked on her, with a focus so complete it felt like a hand pressing against her chest. She was 20 years old. She weighed barely 110 pounds. She carried everything she owned in a single carpet bag, and the finest thing on her body was a cameo brooch pinned at her throat that had belonged to her dead mother. The letter had promised a home. The letter had lied. But what the letter had failed to mention was worse than any lie. Before we continue, if you are new here, I would be grateful if you hit that subscribe button. I share new frontier stories every week, and your support means the world. And drop a comment to let me know where you are listening from tonight. I love hearing from listeners all over the country. Now let us go back. Let us go back to the beginning, to the girl Lena Prescott used to be and the life she was running from. Lena Marie Prescott was born in Boston, Massachusetts in the year 1857 to a household that was poor in everything except love. Her father, Reverend Aldrich Prescott, preached to a congregation of working families in a clapboard church near the harbor. The pews were often patched with mismatched wood. The hymn books had pages missing. The offering plate on Sunday mornings held more copper than silver. But Aldrich Prescott preached like a man who believed every word he spoke, and his congregation believed him right back. Her mother, Dorothea, was a quiet woman with steady hands and a spine made of iron wrapped in cotton. She taught Lena to read before the girl was 5. She taught her to write with proper penmanship. She taught her to sew a straight seam, to stretch a pot of soup across 3 meals, to hold her chin level even when the world was tilting underneath her. Aldrich taught her the rest: Latin, Greek, the writings of the ancient philosophers. Theology, not just the comfortable parts, but the hard questions, the ones that had no easy answers. He taught her that a woman's mind was a gift from God, and that anyone who told her otherwise was lying, whether they wore a collar or a crown. They were happy. That is the part Lena would return to again and again in the years that followed, turning the memory over in her hands the way a traveler turns over a smooth stone found beside a river. They were happy, not in a grand way, not in a way that anyone outside that small house behind the church would have noticed, but in the way that matters most, in the way of people who sit together at the end of the day and are glad of each other's company. The happiness ended on a March morning in 1872 when Lena was 15. Dorothea caught influenza. It started as a cough, dry and persistent, the kind that settles into the chest and refuses to leave. Then came the fever, then the nights of labored breathing, the sheets soaked through the sound of Aldrich praying in the hallway with his forehead pressed against the wall. One morning, Dorothea simply did not wake up. She went in her sleep, her hand still resting in her husband's palm. A mercy, the neighbors said. A blessing. Aldrich never recovered. He continued to preach. He continued to visit the sick, to baptize the newborn, to stand at gravesides and speak of resurrection. But the warmth had gone out of him like a stove that still holds its shape after the fire dies, but gives off no heat. He moved through his duties with the hollowed precision of a man going through motions he no longer understood. 2 years later, consumption took him as well. The same cough, the same fever, the same quiet departure in the small hours of the night. Lena was 17. She was alone. The church elders tried. They were good men with families of their own to feed. They found her a position as a governess with a merchant family on the west side of the city, but that family moved to Ohio within 6 months. Another position fell through when the household lost its income and could not afford her wages. A third ended on a night Lena would never speak of in detail. She would say only that the master of the house came to her room at after midnight, and she left through the kitchen door with her shoes in her hands and nothing else. That was when Philip Ashford appeared. He was a deacon at her father's church, a successful import merchant with a fine house on Beacon Hill and a reputation for generosity. When he heard of Lena's circumstances, he presented himself to the church elders as a solution. He would serve as her legal guardian until she reached her majority at 21. He had the space, the means, and the standing. The elders approved. They shook Ashford's hand and thanked God for his Christian charity. Lena, exhausted and desperate, agreed. For 6 months, the arrangement was everything it appeared to be. Ashford was often away on business. When he was home, he was cordial but distant. Lena had her own room on the third floor. She took her meals with the housekeeper, a kind woman named Mrs. Cartwright, who smelled of bread flour and lavender soap. She spent her days reading in Ashford's extensive library, and she began to believe she might survive. Then one night in late autumn, Ashford returned from a business trip. She heard him come in past midnight, heard his boots on the stairs, heard the particular heaviness of a man who had been drinking, the way each step landed a fraction too hard, a fraction too slow. Her door opened without a knock. He stood in the frame, his collar loosened, his eyes glassy and cold. He told her she owed him. He told her she would marry him when she turned 18. He told her that her father had left debts she had never known about, and that those debts belonged to her now, and the only way to settle them was through marriage. When she tried to push past him to the hallway, he caught her wrist. His grip was iron. It left bruises shaped like fingers that she would hide beneath her sleeves for weeks. He did not strike her, not that night. But the threat lived in every line of his body, in the way he pressed her back against the wall, in the way his breath came hot against her face. The message was clear without words. She belonged to him now. The cage closed slowly. Ashford dismissed Mrs. Cartwright and replaced her with a man named Cormac Voss. Voss was lean and hard and silent. He watched Lena the way a dog watches a rabbit through a fence. He reported her movements. He stood outside her door when Ashford was away, and when Ashford was home, he stood outside the house. Ashford controlled her food, her clothing, her hours. When she disobeyed, he locked her in her room for days, with bread and water slid under the door. When she cried, he laughed a thin sound that had no humor in it. When she stopped crying, he seemed almost disappointed. 2 years of this, 2 years of walls closing in and silence growing teeth. The night before her 21st birthday, Ashford came to her room again. Sober this time, which was worse. A drunk man is reckless. A sober man is precise. He told her the wedding would take place in 1 week. She would sign papers transferring her father's remaining assets to him, the small plot of land where her parents were buried, the few $100s in a trust she had not known existed. He stood in her doorway and told her what would happen on their wedding night. He used words that were clipped and formal, as if discussing a business transaction. Then he left. Lena sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins that she had one chance, one night, one window of time before the cage locked permanently. Every choice was a gamble: stay and marry the monster she knew, or run and face whatever waited in the dark. Lena chose the dark. She waited until 3 in the morning. The house was silent. Voss was asleep in his chair by the front door, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. She moved through the kitchen with bare feet, carrying a carpet bag she had packed over the course of weeks. One change of clothes, her mother's cameo brooch, her father's Greek Bible, its leather cover worn soft from a lifetime of handling, and $20 in coins stolen from Ashford's desk drawer over the span of months, a few cents at a time, hidden in the hem of her dress. It was everything she had in the world. Boston at 3 in the morning was a city of shadows and gaslight. The streets were slick with rain. She walked 5 miles through the darkness, clutching her bag to her chest, flinching at every sound. A carriage rattling past, a dog barking in an alley, a man calling out to her from a doorway, his voice thick with drink. She reached the Sisters of Mercy convent as the first gray light was touching the sky. It was a stone building that sat on the edge of the city like a fortress, surrounded by bare winter trees. She pounded on the heavy wooden door until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. A sleepy nun answered. Lena dropped to her knees on the cold stone step and begged for sanctuary. Mother Superior Agnes was 70 years old. Her hair was steel gray, pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her temples. Her eyes were pale and sharp, the eyes of a woman who had spent half a century looking at the world and had not yet seen anything that surprised her. She listened to Lena's story without interruption. Her hands were folded in her lap, still and dry and patient. When Lena finished shaking and hoarse, Agnes was quiet for a long moment. Then she said one word, "Come." She led Lena to a small room at the end of a long hallway. The room held a narrow bed, a wooden cross on the wall, and a window that looked out onto a garden where nothing grew in winter. Agnes told her she could stay as long as she needed, that the convent walls had protected women for 200 years and they would protect her now, that Philip Ashford could pound on that door until his fist turned to bone and he would never cross the threshold. For 3 months, Lena lived in that small room. She helped the sisters teach children who came to the convent school. She rolled bandages in the hospital ward. She learned to find something close to peace in the rhythm of bells and silence and the scratch of chalk on slate. Then Mother Agnes came to her with a letter. It was from a man named Colton Braddock, a rancher in the Colorado Territory. 3 years earlier, he had delivered a load of timber to the convent chapel free of charge after a fire had gutted the sanctuary. He had refused payment beyond the cost of the wood. "It is for the work you do," he had said. Agnes had not forgotten. Now she was calling in that debt. Her letter to Braddock was a careful lie. She wrote that a young woman in her care had developed a sickness of the lungs. A sister, she wrote, who needed mountain air and high altitude if she was to survive. Would Mr. Braddock have room for her this winter? She would require little, a place to sleep, food to share. She could cook and sew. Braddock's reply came 2 weeks later, written in a hand that was firm and spare, the handwriting of a man who did not waste words on paper any more than he wasted them in speech. "Room available. Will meet Christmas Eve stage." Agnes handed the letter to Lena and waited. Lena stared at the words. "I am not sick. I am not a sister. This is all a lie." Agnes met her eyes without flinching. "It is a way out. Ashford has been making inquiries. He knows you are here. I cannot keep you safe forever. The law, unjust as it is, gives him rights over you. But if you are gone, if you are married to someone else in a territory where his influence does not reach you or beyond his grasp." Married, the word came out barely above a whisper. "Mr. Braddock is a good man. I would not send you to him otherwise. But Lena, understand what I am offering. This is not a position as a governess. This is marriage to a stranger in a place so remote you will be completely dependent on his mercy. What if he is cruel?" Agnes held her gaze. "Then you will have traded one cage for another. But at least it will be a cage with a door you chose to enter. And from what I know of Colton Braddock, he is not a cruel man. He is a lonely one." 3 days later, Lena boarded a train heading west. Boston to New York, New York to Chicago, Chicago to Denver. Each leg of the journey carried her farther from everything she had known, deeper into a landscape that grew wilder with every passing mile. She watched from the window as cities gave way to farmland, farmland, to prairie, prairie, to the jagged line of mountains scraping against the sky that seemed too big to be real. In Denver, the sisters at the local convent gave her a hot meal, a warm bed, and a warning. Life in the high country was brutal. Winters killed. Loneliness could break a person as surely as any disease. She should be prepared for hardship beyond anything she had known in Boston. They also told her something else. They said that frontier life made its own rules, that society's strictures mattered less when survival mattered more, that she might find freedoms in the wilderness she would never have found in the city. Lena did not fully understand what they meant. Not yet. On the morning of December 23, 1877, she boarded the stagecoach to Stone Creek. There were 4 other passengers. An old prospector with a white beard and hands the color of walnut bark, returning to his claim after selling gold in Denver. A young married couple named Virgil and Nettie Hargrave Heading west to start a ranch, their faces bright with the particular optimism of people who have not yet been tested by the country they are entering. And a man who made Lena's skin crawl. His name was Silas Darrow. He was perhaps 40, lean and weathered with pale eyes that moved over everything and everyone with the slow measuring attention of a predator calculating distance. He wore buckskin and carried a rifle balanced across his knees as casually as another man might hold a walking stick. When he looked at Lena, really looked, she felt it in the base of her spine. Not a look of desire, something colder, something that weighed and calculated. Nettie Hargrave noticed. Without a word, she shifted her position so that she sat between Lena and Silas for the remainder of the journey. It was a small act of kindness that Lena would remember long after the woman's face had faded from memory. The stagecoach rocked and jolted over frozen roads. Lena kept her eyes on the window, watching the world transform. Pine forest so thick it swallowed the light. Rock faces sheeted with ice. Valleys so deep they seemed to have no bottom. The cold was a living thing. It found its way through every gap in the coach, through the seams of her cloak, through the thin leather of her boots. She slept badly, waking at every jolt, and sometime in the dark hours she heard the Hargraves whispering. "Those Braddock brothers," Virgil said, "living like savages up in the high country." "3 men," Nettie murmured, "all alone these years, sharing everything. It is not natural. No decent woman would go up there by herself." Lena closed her eyes and pretended to be asleep, but the words burrowed in and would not leave. The stagecoach arrived in Stone Creek on Christmas Eve morning. The town was small. A main street with a general store, a church with a leaning steeple, a saloon with frost on its windows, a boarding house with smoke rising from its chimney. A handful of homes scattered around the edges like afterthoughts. Everything was covered in snow. The air was so cold it burned the inside of Lena's nose with every breath. The driver opened the door and helped the passengers down. The Hargraves headed toward the general store. The old prospector shuffled toward the saloon. Silas Darrow lingered. He stood near the coach and watched Lena with those pale, calculating eyes. "You sure you want to do this, miss?" His voice was rough like gravel dragged across stone. "Them Braddock brothers? They are not natural. 3 men living alone all these years, sharing everything." He paused. "It is not right." Before Lena could answer, a voice cut through the cold air like a blade. "Darrow." Lena turned. 3 men stood at the edge of the street. The 3 men she had seen from the coach window, but had not fully understood until this moment when they were standing 20 feet away and the scale of them became real. Each one was at least 6'5". Their shoulders were wide enough to fill a doorway. Their builds were the kind that spoke of years of labor, not exercise. Thick, muscular, dense with the weight of men who carried timber and wrestled livestock, and had never once set foot in a gymnasium. Their skin was tanned and weathered, marked by sun and wind, and the kind of small scars that come from a life lived with tools and animals in rough country. They were identical. The same chestnut hair, medium-length, wind-tossed, shot through with lighter streaks from the sun. The same amber eyes, the same strong jaw, and straight nose and full mouth set in a line that suggested words did not come easily or often. The one in the middle wore a dark brown leather vest over a work shirt. No bandana. The one on his left had a red bandana knotted at his throat. The one on the right wore blue. And all 3 of them were looking at Lena with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Not hunger, not threat, something else. Something that lived beneath both of those things and was harder to name. Recognition, perhaps. As if she were something they had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. Silas Darrow stiffened. For a moment, Lena thought he might say something more. Then he looked at those 3 identical faces, seemed to read something there that made him reconsider, and walked away without another word. The silence that followed was enormous. Snow fell between them, straight and soft and steady. The one in the middle, the one without a bandana, approached her slowly. He moved the way a man moves toward a horse that has not yet decided whether to bolt. His hand, when he offered it, was large enough to span her entire waist. "Miss Prescott." His voice was deep and quiet with a rasp that suggested he did not use it often. "I am Colton Braddock." Lena placed her small hand in his. His palm was warm despite the cold. Calloused and rough and careful in the way it closed around her fingers, gentle despite the obvious strength. Mr. Braddock, thank you for meeting me. His amber eyes searched her face. She could see up close that they were not simply one color, but flecked with gold and brown like autumn leaves in sunlight. There was intelligence in those eyes, weariness, and underneath both something restless that he was working very hard to hold still. You are not what I expected, he said quietly. Before she could ask what he meant, the one with the red bandana stepped forward. He carried the same face, the same body, but where Colton seemed controlled, this one seemed barely contained. Energy came off him like heat from a forge. We should do this properly, he said. His voice was rougher than Colton's, more direct. I am Harlan Braddock, his brother. The third one, blue bandana, came to stand beside them. The same face again, but his eyes held more gentleness. Or perhaps he was simply better at hiding whatever lived behind them. Emmett Braddock, he said, we are glad you came, Miss Prescott. Lena looked from one identical face to another. Her stomach dropped. I thought, she began, Mother Superior's letter. She said Colton Braddock. She did not mention. She could not finish the sentence. 3 of them. Not one lonely widower, as Agnes had described, but 3 brothers who shared a home, shared a life shared. If the whispers on the stagecoach were true, everything. Colton watched her carefully. We need to talk, he said, but not here. Can you ride? Lena had ridden exactly twice in her life, both times as a child on a neighbor's pony in the churchyard. But she looked at those 3 massive men, at the snow beginning to fall harder, at the mountains rising behind the town like a wall between her and every other option, and she heard her own voice say the words before she had fully decided to speak them. I can learn. Something shifted in Colton's expression. Not quite a smile, closer to respect. Yes, he said softly, I believe you can. The ride up the mountain took 2 hours. The trail wound through pine forest so dense that the world narrowed to a corridor of snow and dark trunks and the sound of hooves crunching through frozen crust. The air thinned as they climbed. Each breath burned Lena's lungs. The cold bit through her cloak, her dress, her skin settling into her bones with a patience that suggested it would never leave. Lucy, the bay mare they had given her, was steady and calm. Lena gripped the saddle with aching legs and tried to match the horse's rhythm. Colton rode beside her, his massive frame at ease in the saddle, his eyes scanning the forest and the trail, and every few minutes her face. Halfway up, Harlan brought his horse alongside. You are doing well, he said. Most city women would be crying by now. I am not most city women, Lena replied, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. He grinned. It changed his face entirely, broke through the hard lines and the feral energy, and left something almost warm in its place. No, I do not believe you are. When the cabin came into view, Lena's first thought was that it looked like something out of a story. It sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines built from dark weathered logs that seemed to grow from the mountainside. Smoke rose from a stone chimney in a thin, steady line. Snow covered the pitched roof and icicles hung from the eaves like crystal daggers. It was beautiful, stark and unforgiving and beautiful. Her second thought was that it was small. 2 rooms, maybe 3, for 4 people. Colton dismounted and came to help her down. His hands spanned her waist completely as he lifted her from the saddle and set her on the ground. She swayed her legs unsteady after the long ride, and his hands remained on her waist a moment longer than necessary, steadying her, or perhaps unwilling to let go. Welcome home, he said. Home. The word should have comforted her. Instead, it sent something through her that was equal parts warmth and warning. The main room took up most of the cabin. A huge stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mouth wide enough for a man to stand inside if he bent his head. A fire burned there, throwing golden light across rough wooden floors covered with woven rugs and muted reds and browns. A table stood near the window with 3 chairs beneath it. 3, not 4. A simple kitchen occupied one corner, cast iron stove shelves of dishes and supplies, a water bucket on a wooden counter. Against the far wall leaned a bookshelf holding perhaps 20 volumes with cracked spines. And in the corner beside the window, almost hidden in the firelight, hung a small cross carved from cedar wood, suspended by a leather strip. But what stopped Lena's breath was the doorway to the left. Above it, carved into the wooden beam in letters that had been smoothed by time and touch, was a name. Ruth. Colton followed her gaze. His expression closed like a door. That was my wife's room, he said. It has been empty for 8 years. We cleaned it for you. Emmett carried her bag inside and showed her the space. A narrow bed covered with a quilt in blue and gray, stitched in patterns of remarkable precision. A dresser with an oil lamp and a small mirror. Glass jars on a shelf filled with dried herbs long past any use. A wicker sewing basket in the corner, its lid closed and pale with dust. Everything in this room had belonged to Ruth, and now it belonged to Lena. We tried not to disturb her things, Emmett said softly. But if you want anything removed, say the word. Lena touched the quilt, felt the careful stitches beneath her fingertips. She made this. Yes, Ruth was good with her hands. Sewing, carving, growing things. His voice went soft with memory. She loved this place. Said it was the closest thing to heaven she would see on this side of the ground. How did she die? The question came out before Lena could stop it. Emmett's expression shifted. Something dark moved behind his eyes, then was carefully put away. That is Colton's story to tell, he said. But I will say this, her death nearly destroyed us, all three of us. He left her alone. Lena sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her coat and gloves, and tried to understand what was happening. She was in a cabin on a mountain, 7 miles from the nearest town, with 3 men who looked identical and who had all apparently loved the same woman. A woman whose room she now occupied, whose bed she would sleep in, whose ghost seemed to linger in every dust-covered corner. Through the thin wall she could hear them. Harlan's voice first. She is not what you said. You told us she was a sister, older, plain. Colton. That is what Mother Superior wrote. I did not know. Emmett quiet but certain. She is young and she is beautiful, and she came all this way alone. We cannot send her back. Colton. I am not saying we send her back. I am saying we need to be honest with her. A pause, Harlan again lower this time. Do you feel it, what I feel when I look at her, Colton? Yes. Emmett, we all do. Silence, then footsteps, a soft knock on her door. Lena stood, smoothed her dress, and tried to compose her face into something that did not look as terrified as she felt. Colton entered, ducking slightly to clear the frame. In the small room, he seemed impossibly large. There was barely space for both of them. Miss Prescott, I think we should speak plainly. Yes, Lena said, I think we should. He sat in the single wooden chair. She remained standing, her back near the window. The glass was cold against her shoulder blades. Mother Superior's letter was not entirely truthful, he said. No, I am not a sister. I have never taken vows, and I am not sick. I gathered as much when I saw you. So why did you agree to this? Why invite a stranger into your home based on a letter full of lies? He was quiet for a long time. The fire in the next room popped and crackled. Snow ticked softly against the window. Because I am lonely, he said at last. Because my brothers are lonely. Because we have lived in this cabin for 8 years with no one but each other, and the silence has become something we cannot carry much longer. He leaned forward slightly. His hands were clasped between his knees, enormous and scarred and careful. We need a wife, Miss Prescott. All 3 of us. And unless I am wrong, you need to be beyond the reach of whoever you are running from. The air in the room seemed to tighten. 3 husbands, Lena whispered. Yes, that is impossible. Illegal. It is how we live. It is how we loved Ruth, and it is how we would care for you if you choose to stay. Care for, not own, not claim. The distinction was not lost on her. And if I refuse, Colton reached into his vest and set a small leather pouch on the edge of the dresser. The clink of coins was unmistakable. $300, enough for passage anywhere in the country and money to live on while you find your feet. We will take you back to Stone Creek tomorrow and put you on the first stage heading wherever you want to go. $300, more money than Lena had held in her entire life. You have until tomorrow evening, he said. Think about it. Pray about it if that helps. But know this. He stood and his shadow fell across her like a blanket, warm and heavy and inescapable. If you stay, if you choose us, we will protect you. We will provide for you. You will never want for anything. And you will belong to all 3 of us. Completely. He left before she could respond. Lena sat back down on Ruth's bed and stared at Ruth's sewing basket and Ruth's dried herbs and Ruth's ghost hovering in every corner. Outside the window, night was falling. The snow continued to fall with it silent and patient, covering the world in white, erasing every road and trail and path that had brought her here, leaving only the question of which path she would choose next. In the main room, she could hear the brothers settling into their evening. The clink of dishes, the crackle of the fire, the low murmur of voices, and beneath it all, a hum of attention, of anticipation, like the whole cabin was holding its breath, waiting for her answer. But what she did not know, what she could not have known, was what lay hidden beneath the false bottom of that old wicker sewing basket, a secret that would change everything. Not just for her, for all of them. The cabin held them in its fragile warmth. The fire burned, the snow fell, and Lena Prescott, alone in a dead woman's room, began to understand that the most dangerous thing about her situation was not the three men on the other side of the wall. It was how badly she wanted to say yes. She did not sleep well. The bed was narrow and the mattress was stuffed with straw and wool, and it smelled faintly of lavender that had long since lost its sweetness. The quilt was heavy on her body, stitched in patterns of blue and gray that she traced with her fingertips in the dark, feeling the tiny, precise stitches that Ruth had set there years ago. Every stitch was a reminder. Another woman had slept in this bed. Another woman had lain under this quilt and listened to these same men breathing in the next room. Another woman had loved them, and another woman had died. Through the thin log wall, Lena could hear the brothers settling in for the night. The scrape of a boot being pulled off, the creak of wood under weight, the low rumble of a voice she could not quite make out, and then the sound of a harmonica. Someone was playing soft and slow, a melody that drifted through the cabin like wood smoke. It was mournful and beautiful, the kind of music a man plays not for an audience, but for himself, to put words to a feeling he cannot speak aloud. Lena pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass. Outside, the snow was still falling. Straight down, steady, patient. The kind of snow that does not hurry because it knows it has all night and all the next day and all the winter to do its work. She closed her eyes and thought of her father. What would Aldrich Prescott say if he could see his daughter now, alone in a dead woman's bed on a mountain in Colorado, being asked to marry three men she had known for less than a day? She thought he would say the same thing he always said when the world presented her with a question that had no good answer. Think with your mind, Lena. Pray with your heart. And then act with your courage, because God did not make cowards, only people who have not yet found the thing worth being brave for. The harmonica faded, the fire settled, and Lena lay awake in the dark, listening to the silence, waiting for morning. Morning came gray and cold. She woke to the sound of the stove door opening, the clank of a coffee pot being set on iron, the crack and hiss of fresh wood catching flame. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then memory flooded back, and she sat up quickly, her heart hammering. She dressed in the same navy traveling dress. Her hair was a disaster from sleep and the long journey. She found Ruth's brush on the dresser, and it felt strange and intimate to use something that had belonged to the dead woman. But she used it anyway, pulling the bristles through tangled honey blonde waves until they fell smooth past her shoulders. In the small mirror, her reflection looked pale. Her blue eyes were too large in her face, but her chin was lifted. She would face this with dignity, whatever this turned out to be. When she opened her door, all three brothers were in the main room. They had clearly been awake for hours. The fire was built high, coffee steamed in tin cups. The smell of frying bacon and toasted bread filled the cabin with warmth and fat and something that felt against all reason like home. Colton stood at the stove cooking. His broad back was covered by a flannel shirt this morning, and every movement made the fabric pull tight across his shoulders. Harlan sat at the table whittling something from a piece of pine shavings curling to the floor around his boots. Emmett stood by the window with his coffee, watching the white world outside. All three turned when they heard her door. The weight of their attention was immediate and total. 6 amber eyes tracking her movement across the room. She felt measured, examined, wanted in a way that made heat rise to her face despite the morning cold. "Good morning, Miss Prescott," Colton said. His voice was carefully neutral. "I trust you slept." "Well enough, thank you." Emmett pulled out the chair closest to the fire. "Please sit. You must be hungry." She sat. Within moments, a plate appeared before her. Bacon fried eggs, thick slices of bread toasted brown on the stovetop. More food than she normally ate in an entire day at Ashford's house. When she looked up, all three were watching her. "Eat," Harlan said. It was not quite a command, but close. "You are too thin." She ate slowly, aware of their eyes, aware of the silence that was not uncomfortable, but was heavy with expectation. The food was simple but good. The eggs were cooked through the bacon crisp, the bread warm. When she finished, Emmett refilled her coffee without being asked. The gesture was small, domestic, and it unsettled her in ways she could not explain. Finally, she set down her cup and met Colton's gaze. "I have thought about what you said, Isam," she told him, "and I have conditions." Something moved in his eyes, something that might have been hope held very carefully in check. "Name them." "First, the 3 months as you promised. At the end, I decide whether to stay or take the money and go. No argument." "Agreed." "Second, if I stay, you will treat me as a partner, not a possession. I will have a voice in decisions that affect my life." Harlan leaned back in his chair. "Fair." "Third," she paused, drew a breath. This was the part that cost her the most to say aloud. "You will be patient with me. I have never shared a life with anyone. You will have to teach me this world, and you will go slowly." Emmett's voice was quiet when he answered. "We will treat you like the precious thing you are." The room was still. The fire popped. Snow ticked against the window. "Then I accept," Lena said. "For 3 months I will be your wife." The change was immediate. Something that had been coiled tight in the room, released like a rope under tension, suddenly cut free. Colton rose from his chair, and his brothers rose with him, and they moved toward her together with that strange, synchronized coordination of men who had lived as one body for years. Colton's calloused hand cupped her face. Warm, careful. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and for a moment neither of them breathed. "This is where you belong," he said quietly. It was the first time he said those words. It would not be the last. Harlan's hand found her shoulder, and she felt the warmth of him through the fabric of her dress. Emmett stood close, not touching, but present, his gentle eyes holding hers. "Are you frightened?" Emmett asked. "Terrified," Lena admitted. "Good," Colton said. "That means you understand what you have chosen. But Lena, we will not rush you. This first week we will teach you this life. The ranch, the mountain, the work that keeps us alive. We will build trust before anything else." She nodded. She did not trust her voice. She had made her choice. Now she had to live inside it. And somewhere beyond the frosted glass, the mountain waited, patient as the snow, vast as the silence, ready to test every promise they had made and every ounce of courage she had left. But what none of them knew, not Lena, not Colton, not Harlan, not Emmett, was that the mountain was keeping secrets of its own. That a dead woman's diary lay hidden beneath a false bottom in a dusty sewing basket. That a man with pale eyes was watching from 5 miles away. And that by the time spring came, every truth they thought they knew would be shattered, rebuilt, and shattered again. Winter had only just begun. The days found their rhythm, and Lena found hers inside it. Mornings belonged to Harlan. He was waiting for her each day before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, standing in the cold outside the barn, with breath steaming from his mouth and an expression that said he would not accept excuses. The first morning he showed her the animals. 3 horses occupied the barn, massive creatures that matched their owners in scale. Lucy, the bay mare, was the gentlest and had been assigned to Lena. A milk cow named Bonnie stood in her stall with the patient resignation of an animal that had been milked 10,000 times and expected 10,000 more. And in a coop that Harlan had built with surprising care, straw packed tight between double walls of pine to hold in warmth and shut out drafts, a flock of speckled hens huddled together against the cold. "These animals keep us alive through winter," Harlan told her. "You feed them before you feed yourself. Always." He showed her how to scatter grain for the chickens without startling them, moving her hands slow and low, speaking in a voice softer than she would have thought him capable of. He showed her how to reach beneath a hen for eggs, cupping the warm shell in her palm and lifting it free while the bird clucked in mild protest. He showed her how to milk the cow, positioning the bucket between her knees, wrapping her fingers around the teat and pulling in a steady downward rhythm, squeezing and releasing until the warm milk hissed against tin. His hands covered hers on the bucket, guiding the rhythm. The contact was practical. instructional. But Lena felt the strength held in check behind those calloused palms, the ease with which he could crush what he chose instead to teach, and something in her chest shifted in a way she did not have a name for yet. After the barn, the woodpile, Harlan handed her an axe that was smaller than the one he used but still heavy in her grip. He set a round of pine on the splitting block and stepped back. "Show me." She swung. The blade bounced off the wood and nearly took the axe out of her hands. Harlan did not laugh. He stepped behind her, adjusted her grip, repositioned her feet. "Feel the weight of the head," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Let it do the work. You are not fighting the wood. You are letting gravity and steel do what they were made for. Lift, swing, follow through." He guided her through the motion once, twice, 3 times. By the 10th round, her arms burned and her shoulders screamed and sweat had gathered at her temples, despite the freezing air. But she had split 3 logs on her own clean down the center, and when she looked up, Harlan was watching her with an expression she had not seen before on his face. Respect, grudging perhaps, but real. "You are stronger than you look," he said. "Good, you will need to be." That afternoon, as they walked back from the woodpile and Lena's boot hit a patch of hidden ice, she slipped and nearly went down hard. Harlan caught her by the arm, held her steady, and when she thanked him, he said something that would stay with her long after the moment had passed. "The mountain does not care, Lena, but I do." It was the first time he had used her given name. Afternoons belonged to Emmett. He was the quietest of the 3, and at first Lena mistook his silence for coldness. She was wrong. Emmett's silence was the silence of a man who listened more than he spoke, who noticed what others missed, who carried his feelings deep beneath the surface, where they could not be easily disturbed. He took her down to the root cellar built into the hillside 50 yards from the cabin. The door was heavy timber, and when he pulled it open, the smell of damp earth and dried provisions rolled out like a held breath. Inside, by the light of a lantern, Lena saw the architecture of survival. Barrels of flour and cornmeal stacked 3 high. Sacks of dried beans and rice tied with twine and marked with dates in a careful hand. Smoked venison and elk hanging from iron hooks driven into the ceiling beams. Rows of glass jars sealed with wax holding preserved vegetables and fruit from the previous autumn's harvest. "We stock up in the fall," Emmett explained. "Once the snow gets deep, there is no getting to town for months at a stretch. Everything we need to live through winter, we keep here." He taught her to count and track the supplies, to rotate the older provisions forward so nothing spoiled, to stretch a meal across 4 plates when the portions wanted to feed only 3. He was patient in a way that reminded Lena of her father, answering each question thoroughly, never making her feel foolish for asking. Then he opened a small wooden box. Inside were bundles of dried herbs, each one tied with string and labeled in the same careful handwriting. "Yarrow," he said, lifting one. "Stops bleeding. You pack it into a wound and press hard." Another bundle. "Willow bark. You chew it for pain and fever. Works nearly as well as the laudanum we cannot afford." A third. "Elderberry. Brew it as tea for winter colds." He paused and something moved behind his eyes. "Ruth taught me most of what I know about healing. She had a gift for it. Hands that could feel what was wrong before the eyes could see it." It was the first time any of them had spoken Ruth's name in ordinary conversation without weight or warning. The grief flickered across Emmett's face, quick as a cloud shadow crossing a field, and then was gone. When he handed Lena the bundle of yarrow, their fingers touched. The contact was brief, but it sent a current through her skin that lingered long after his hand had pulled away. "Winter always ends," Emmett said when she worried aloud about whether the supplies would last. "It just takes its time about it." Evenings belonged to Colton. After supper, while Harlan cleaned the dishes with surprising domesticity, and Emmett tended to whatever small repair the cabin demanded that day, Colton would pull 2 chairs close to the fire and hand Lena a book from the shelf. The first night it was Thoreau, Walden. He asked her to read aloud the passage on solitude, on stripping life down to its essentials, on meeting the universe in the marrow of a single quiet hour. Lena read, and the cabin filled with words that seemed written for this exact place, this exact moment, as if Thoreau had somehow seen this clearing in the pines and these 4 people gathered around a fire a quarter century after his death. When she finished, Colton was watching her. The firelight caught the amber in his eyes and turned it to molten gold. "That is why we live here," he said. "Not because we cannot handle the world below, because we choose not to. Out here, we make our own rules. We answer to the mountain and to each other. Nothing else. Their conversations those evenings ranged wide. Philosophy, theology, the ethics of frontier justice where the nearest lawman was 3 days' ride and a man's word was the only court that mattered. Lena had read widely in her father's library, and she found herself, perhaps since Aldrich's death, treated as an intellectual equal by a man whose mind she respected. She could feel Colton testing her not with condescension, but with genuine curiosity, probing the edges of her thinking the way a carpenter tests the grain of wood before deciding where to cut. One evening their shoulders touched. Neither moved away. She could smell pine sap and leather and wood smoke on his skin, and underneath those things something warmer that was simply him. But what Lena would find hidden in the bottom of a dead woman's sewing basket was going to change everything. And when she uncovered the truth, nothing would ever be the same. The storm came in the second week without warning. One moment the sky was a flat expanse of winter gray. The next the wind hit the cabin like a fist, screaming through every gap in the logs, driving snow sideways in sheets so thick the world beyond the porch disappeared entirely. The temperature dropped so fast that the water in the bucket by the stove began to form a skin of ice. Then from the barn, a sound cut through the wind. The cow bellowing, not a sound of complaint but of distress, deep and guttural and urgent. "She is calving," Emmett said. His face went tight. "It is too early. She should not be due for another 3 weeks." They moved without discussion. Colton grabbed a lantern and a coil of rope. Harlan threw on his coat and was out the door before anyone else. Emmett turned to Lena. "I need you. Can you hold a lantern steady in a blizzard?" She did not hesitate. Yes. The 50 yards between the cabin and the barn were the longest of her life. The wind hit her the moment she stepped off the porch, driving the breath from her chest and nearly taking her off her feet. Snow plastered against her face found its way down her collar, turned her fingers numb within seconds. She held the lantern in both hands and pushed forward one step at a time, following the dark shapes of the brothers, through a world that had gone white and wild and deaf. Inside the barn, the cow lay on her side in the straw, her flanks heaving, her eyes rolling with pain. Emmett knelt beside her and assessed the situation with hands that were suddenly calm and sure. The calf was turned wrong. It would need to be repositioned. "Hold the light here," Emmett told Lena, pointing. "Do not let the wind take it. Whatever you hear, whatever you see, you hold that light steady." Harlan held the cow still. Colton braced against the wind at the barn door, his body filling the frame, blocking the worst of the storm, with nothing but his own mass. And Emmett worked his hands, moving with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his size, coaxing and turning and guiding until the calf found the right angle and the world's oldest process could continue. It took 2 hours. Lena held the lantern the entire time. Her arms shook. Her fingers went from numb to painful to something beyond pain, a dull absence of sensation that frightened her more than the cold. Her hair froze in strands against her temples. She did not complain. She did not lower the light. She held it exactly where Emmett needed it, and she watched 3 men work together with the wordless coordination of a single organism. The calf came at midnight, small and wet and trembling. Emmett wrapped it in a blanket and placed it against its mother's side. The cow lowed softly and began to lick. Harlan looked at Lena. Her dress was soaked. Her face was raw from the wind. Her hands, when she finally lowered the lantern, were shaking so badly she could barely uncurl her fingers. "You are not like any city woman I have ever met," he said. Lena met his eyes. "I am not any city woman you have ever met." That night, the 4 of them sat around the fire in wet clothes, passing a single tin cup of hot coffee between them. No one spoke for a long time, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who have done something difficult together and know it without needing to say so. A thread had been tied between them, invisible but real, and Lena could feel it pulling. "We will get through this," Colton said. It was the first time he had said "we" instead of "us" and "you." In the 3rd week, something broke open. Not a dramatic rupture, not a single defining moment, more like ice melting at the edge of a stream, slow and steady and irreversible. Lena laughed, not the polite, guarded sound she had been making. A real laugh, uncontrolled, the kind that starts in the belly and cannot be stopped. Harlan had been telling the story of trying to break a wild Mustang 3 summers back, A story that involved being thrown clear off the horse 3 times, chasing the animal through a creek in his boots, and eventually watching it disappear over a ridge while he stood in knee-deep water with a broken rein in each hand. He told it with the self-mocking precision of a man who had made peace with his own failures. And Lena laughed until her eyes watered, and the brothers stared at her like they were hearing music after 8 years of silence. That evening, Emmett played his harmonica, a song Ruth used to love, he said, slow and sweet and aching, and Lena, without thinking, began to hum along. Then to sing her voice small and clear, a soprano that floated above the harmonica's low melody like a bird above a river. When the song ended, no one spoke. The fire popped. The wind pressed against the walls, and something that had been sealed shut in all 4 of them quietly opened. Later, by the dying fire, Lena told them about Ashford. She told them everything. The locked room, the bread and water, Cormac Voss standing sentry outside her door, the night Ashford came to her room sober and told her what the wedding night would look like using words as sharp and clean as surgical instruments. She told it without shame. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. When she finished, the brothers were silent. Harlan's jaw was clenched so tight a vein stood out at his temple. Emmett held her hand, his grip light, asking nothing. And Colton looked at her with those amber eyes and said 5 words. That life is over now. He said it the way a man drives a nail into a board, with finality, with certainty, with the absolute conviction that what has been fastened will hold. That life is over now. Lena would hear those words again in the weeks to come every time she woke, gasping from a dream of Ashford's footsteps in the hallway. Every time, and every time they would help. Then she asked about Ruth. She said it plainly. If she was going to live in this woman's room, sleep in this woman's bed, wear the quilt this woman had stitched, she deserved to know who Ruth had been. Colton told it. His voice, normally so controlled, cracked and mended, and cracked again as he spoke. Her name was Ruth Whitmore before she married them. She came west with her family at 18. Her father ran the general store in Stone Creek. She was small and dark-haired, with a laugh that could fill a room and hands that could make anything beautiful. They met her at a church social, all 3 of them, and all 3 of them were struck in the same moment by the same lightning. They thought they would have to compete, that she would choose one and break the hearts of the other 2, but Ruth had her own ideas about love and its limits. She told them she loved them equally, that she could not choose one without losing the others, that if they were willing, she would belong to all 3. It had taken time, wrestling with conscience and convention and the voice of a world that would call them sinners. But Ruth was persuasive in the way of a woman who knows her own heart and will not be argued out of it. For 7 years, they were a family. Then Colton's voice went flat. The color drained from it like water running out of a cracked jar. It was winter, he said, 8 years ago this month, December the 24th. The same day they had met Lena. The coincidence sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Ruth had woken early that Christmas Eve morning and announced she was going to gather firewood before they started cooking dinner. They told her no. The snow was too deep, nearly 4 feet in places. They would go. But Ruth was stubborn. She had hated feeling helpless. And when they went to the barn to tend the horses, she slipped out the cabin door without them knowing. By the time they realized she had not come back, an hour had passed. Colton found her, 100 yards from the cabin, face down in the snow. I thought she had fallen, he said. His voice was barely a whisper now. Hit her head on a rock, hidden under the white. I carried her back. She was still warm. I thought maybe I prayed, maybe she was only unconscious. He stopped, drew a breath that shuddered through his entire body. But when Emmett examined her, when he unwound her scarf, he could not finish. Emmett finished for him, his gentle voice gone hard as stone. Bruises around her throat, dark purple, in the shape of fingers. Someone had strangled her and left her in the snow to die. The room was silent except for the fire. There were no tracks, Harlan said. The snow had covered everything. The nearest neighbor was Silas Darrow, 5 miles out. He swore he had not left his cabin that day. We buried her the next morning, Colton said, on the hill under the aspens, and we have lived with the guilt ever since. We should have gone with her, should have stopped her, should have protected her. Lena crossed the room. She stood in front of Colton and placed both of her small hands on either side of his face, tilting his head so he had no choice but to look at her. "You did not kill her," she said. "Someone else did, someone evil, and that person is the one who should carry the guilt. Not you, not your brothers, not for one more day." Something broke behind his eyes. For the first time in 8 years, Colton Braddock wept. Not quietly, not with the restrained dignity of a man holding himself together. Great racking sobs that shook his massive frame like wind shaking a tree. Harlan came to him. Emmett came to him. They held each other, the three of them grieving Ruth openly for the first time since they had put her in the ground. And Lena held them all. Her arms were not large enough to encompass even one of them, but she held them all the same, and she made a vow in the silence of her own heart that she would help these men heal, that she would not let the past consume the future they were building together. That night, Lena did not bolt her bedroom door, but the secret hidden in the bottom of Ruth's sewing basket, Jill was about to test every promise she had made, and the price of the truth would be higher than any of them imagined. The discovery came in the fourth week. By then, Lena's hands had grown rough from work, and her body had grown strong from it. She could split a log clean with 3 swings. She could milk Bonnie in the dark. She could bake bread from scratch, the dough rising warm beneath a cloth by the stove, while the cabin filled with a smell that made even Harlan smile. But it was the small moments that mattered most. Colton reading aloud by firelight, while Lena mended a torn shirt, their shoulders touching, neither pulling away. Harlan carrying her across a frozen creek because her boots were not thick enough, his arms steady and warm, her hand braced against his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat through the fabric. Emmett teaching her to identify dried herbs, their heads bent close over a worn botanical guide, his breath warm on her cheek, and when their eyes met over the page, neither looked away. She was falling in love, with all 3 of them, each in a different way, and Lena Prescott was no longer afraid of what she felt. That night alone in Ruth's room, she finally opened the sewing basket. She had been avoiding it, respecting the dead woman's privacy. But curiosity is a tide that rises whether you want it to or not, and that night in the quiet after the fire had died to embers and the brothers had gone to sleep, Lena lifted the wicker lid. Inside she found needles thread in 6 colors, scraps of fabric, and beneath those a partially finished embroidery. A cover for the small cedar cross that hung beside the window worked in blue and gold thread with a pattern of vines and leaves. Ruth had been making it when she died. The needle was still threaded, still pierced through the fabric, waiting for a hand that would never return. Lena lifted the embroidery carefully. Beneath it, the basket had a bottom that seemed too high. She pressed on it, and it shifted. A false bottom fitted so precisely it was nearly invisible. Underneath, she found a small leather-bound journal, Ruth's diary. Lena knew she should not read it. The words were private, intimate, meant only for the woman who had written them. But she opened the cover anyway, and the first page caught her like a hook. The early entries were full of light. Ruth's joy in her 3 husbands, her love for the mountain, her delight in the small victories of frontier life, a garden that flourished, a quilt completed a full-born healthy in the spring. But as the pages turned, the light dimmed. One entry written perhaps 6 months before Ruth died read, "He came again today. I told him to leave. He does not understand that I have made my choice. The brothers do not know he visits when they are away. I fear what he might do if I tell them." Another weeks later, he grabbed my arm today, told me I was wasting myself on 3 men when I could have one who would give me everything. I pushed him away. I am frightened now. Ruth never wrote the name, but she did not need to. The final entry was dated the day before Ruth died. I saw him watching the cabin from the tree line today. His eyes were full of rage. "I must tell Colton, but I am afraid of what will happen. He is not a man who accepts refusal. If I die, it will not be the mountain that killed me. It will be the sentence ended there, unfinished." The ink trailed off the edge of the word, and as if the pen had been set down in a hurry or in fear. Lena closed the journal. Her hands were shaking. Silas Darrow, the man from the stagecoach, the man with the pale, predatory eyes who had watched her with that cold, measuring look. He had loved Ruth. He had stalked Ruth. He had threatened Ruth. And Ruth had died with bruises shaped like fingers around her throat. But what could Lena do with this knowledge? She had no proof beyond an old diary that named no names. And if she told the brothers, if she showed them what Ruth had written, what would happen, Colton would ride down that mountain and kill Silas Darrow with his bare hands. And then Colton would be a murderer, and everything they were building would burn. Lena hid the diary back beneath the false bottom. She would wait. She would watch. And if Silas Darrow ever came near this cabin, she would be ready. But the diary was not the only thing Ruth had left behind. The next day, while the brothers were working outside, Lena searched further. She pulled books from the shelf one by one, fanning the pages. In the back of a volume of Walt Whitman Leaves of Grass, she found a single folded letter. The paper was yellowed. The handwriting was not Ruth's. Ruth, you know how I feel. You have always known. I will not stand by and watch you waste yourself on three men who cannot give you what one man can. Leave them. Come to me. If you do not, I cannot answer for what happens next. This is your last chance. SD, a written threat. Physical evidence. Dated 3 weeks before Ruth's murder. Lena's hands trembled as she refolded the letter and hid it with the diary. Two predators were circling this mountain now. One from the east with lawyers and money and a legal claim that might or might not still hold. One from 5 miles away with pale eyes and a secret that had been buried for 8 years. And Lena, standing between them and the three men she loved, understood that spring would bring a reckoning for all of them. In the 5th week, Colton took Lena to the hilltop where Ruth was buried. The simple stone marker was half covered in snow. He cleared it with his bare hands, brushing the white away from the carved letters until the name was visible. Ruth Braddock. He knelt beside the grave for a long time, his head bowed, his breath making small clouds in the still air. When he stood and turned to Lena, the longing on his face stole her breath. I need you to understand something, he said. I loved Ruth. We all did. Her death nearly destroyed us. But Lena, you are not her replacement. You are not filling a space she left behind. You are something new. Something none of us expected. He paused. The wind moved through the bare aspens and the branches clicked together like dry bones. I find myself wanting to share a future with you, he said, in ways that surprised me, in ways I was not sure I was still capable of. Lena took his hand, her small fingers laced through his massive ones. She did not speak. Words would have been insufficient, but the gesture said what needed to be said. I am here. I am choosing this. I am choosing you. That night, Lena left Ruth's room. She crossed the cabin to the main bedroom where the brothers slept, and she stood in the doorway until Colton saw her. He did not speak. He simply lifted the edge of the blanket. She lay down between them, surrounded by their warmth, and the door closed softly on whatever came before. When morning arrived, everything was different, not in any way that could be seen from outside. The cabin looked the same. The mountain had not moved, but something fundamental had shifted in the space between four people. A declaration made not with words, but with trust, with the simple act of choosing to be near someone when you could have stayed safely apart. They were building something together now, built with their own hands. 8 weeks after her arrival, Lena woke before dawn with her stomach in revolt. She barely made it outside before her body emptied itself in the snow. She knelt there pale and shaking the cold air burning her face and tried to remember the last time she had felt this particular kind of sickness. Emmett found her. He had been up early checking on the new calf. He took one look at her face and his expression changed. How long since your last monthly courses? He asked quietly. Lena counted backward. 6 weeks. 7. She had been so absorbed in her new life that she had not noticed their absence. I am with child, she whispered. Emmett pulled her into his arms and held her against his chest. He was warm and solid and steady, and his voice when he spoke was thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. Yes, he said, I believe you are. That evening they told Colton and Harlan. Both brothers went still. Then both moved toward Lena at the same time, their hands finding her stomach, their amber eyes bright with what looked very much like wonder. A child. Colton's voice came out rough, cracked at the edges. Our child. You will stay now, Harlan said, and his voice was not rough or commanding or wild. It was fragile. You will stay. Lena looked at their 3 identical faces, at the love and fear written there in equal measure, and spoke the truth she had been carrying for weeks. I was always going to stay, she said. I just did not know it until now. You are our home, Harlan told her that night. It was the first time she had heard his voice break. 2 weeks later, the sound of hooves came up the mountain trail. Lena was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin. The brothers were checking the trap line on the far ridge and would not be back for hours. She was alone. The rider who came into the clearing was not Silas Darrow, though that was her first fear. He was younger, better dressed, with a face that might have been handsome, if not for the cold calculation behind his eyes. He dismounted and looked at the cabin at the laundry at Lena with the same appraising expression she had seen on livestock buyers at the Boston docks. "Miss Prescott," he said. Her blood went cold. No one here knew that name except the brothers and the people of Stone Creek. "Who are you, Mr. Cormac Voss?" "I work for Philip Ashford." A thin smile. "He has been looking for you for a very long time." Lena ran. She made it 3 steps toward the cabin door before Voss caught her arm. His grip was iron, the same bruising grip that had held her in Ashford's house, the grip of a man who has practiced restraining women and has become efficient at it. He produced a length of rope and bound her wrists with the speed of long practice. She screamed. The sound echoed off the mountain and came back to her small and useless. Voss was dragging her toward his horse when 3 gunshots split the air, one after another, deliberate, evenly spaced, not shots fired in panic. Shots fired as a statement. Colton, Harlan, and Emmett emerged from the tree line with rifles raised. They must have heard the horse from the ridge and come running. All 3 of them were breathing hard, and all 3 of their faces held the same expression. Not anger, something beyond anger. The focused, absolute stillness of men who have decided that violence is coming and have made their peace with it. "Step away from our wife," Colton said. Voss laughed. It was a thin, nervous sound. "Your wife, this woman, is the legal ward of Philip Ashford. I am here to return her to her guardian." "She is carrying our child," Colton said. His voice was flat and final, the voice of a man stating facts that are not open to debate. "If you take her, you take our baby. Think carefully about whether you are willing to pay for Philip Ashford's obsession." Voss looked at Lena's stomach, not yet showing beneath her dress. He looked at 3 rifles that had not wavered by so much as an inch. He calculated the odds the way he calculated everything with cold precision, and the math did not work. He cut the ropes from her wrists. "This is not over," he said. "Ashford will come himself." Harlan's smile was the coldest thing on that mountain. "Let him come, we will be waiting." Voss rode away without looking back. The moment he was gone, Lena's legs gave out. The brothers caught her before she hit the ground, gathered her into their arms, 3 massive bodies forming a wall around her that nothing could breach. "He knows where we are," Lena whispered. "Philip will come. He will bring men. He will take me." Colton held her face in his hands. His palms were rough and warm and completely steady. "No," he said. "He will try and he will fail. We protect what is ours, Lena, whatever it takes." Spring was still weeks away, and somewhere to the east, Philip Ashford was making plans. But tonight, Lena was surrounded by the 3 men who had chosen her as surely as she had chosen them, carrying a child that belonged to all of them, living a life that society would call impossible. She had never been happier. She had never been in more danger. That night, after Lena had stopped shaking and the cabin was locked and barred, and every window checked twice, the brothers sat at the table and made their plans. Colton's voice was quiet but carried the weight of iron. "He will come with men. Ashford is not the kind who does his own fighting. He will hire guns, maybe 4, maybe 6. And he will come with paper, some legal claim, real or forged, to make it look righteous." Harlan leaned back. "Then we make sure we have more guns and better ground. We fortify. Extra food in the cabin, ammunition counted and divided, escape routes through the north timber if it comes to that." Colton looked at Lena. "And you learn to shoot." The next morning, Harlan took her behind the barn with a rifle. Her hands were small, and the weapon was heavy, but when she lifted it to her shoulder and sighted down the barrel at a knot in a pine tree 60 yards out, something settled in her that had always been there waiting. She pulled the trigger. The kick jolted her shoulder. The bark exploded 2 inches left of the knot. Harlan stared. Again. She fired again. This time the knot splintered. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, and there was genuine surprise in his voice, which was not something Harlan Braddock gave away easily. "My father taught me to observe," Lena said, "to watch carefully and to notice what others miss. Observation and marksmanship are not so different. Both require patience. Both require stillness. Both require the willingness to wait for the right moment before you act. Harlan looked at her with something new in his expression, something that went beyond respect and beyond attraction and landed in the territory of genuine awe. "You are full of surprises, Lena Prescott." "Braddock," she corrected, and the word came out before she had decided to say it. He went very still. Then a smile broke across his face, rare and wide and real, and for a moment the wild man looked like a boy. Despite the threat, or perhaps because of it, those weeks became some of the happiest Lena had known. Trapped together by the deep snow, the four of them developed rhythms that felt less like an arrangement and more like a family. Colton read aloud in the evenings, his deep voice filling the cabin with the words of Thoreau and Whitman and the Warren family Bible, while Lena sat close beside him mending clothes by firelight, their shoulders touching in a contact so constant it had become as natural as breathing. Harlan whittled. A small wooden horse took shape under his knife, then a set of tiny blocks, each one sanded smooth. Toys for a baby that had not yet arrived, but that he was already preparing him for with the same fierce determination he brought to everything. Emmett played his harmonica each evening after supper. The melodies had changed. Where once he had played only the mournful songs that Ruth had loved, he now played lighter tunes. Songs with movement and warmth. Songs that made Lena tap her foot and Harlan hum along and Colton close his eyes with an expression that was not grief but something closer to peace. They told her stories of their childhood. Growing up as triplets in a small town in Missouri, identical in every way, forever confusing teachers and neighbors, and the girl at the dry goods store who could never remember which one had asked her to dance. The death of their parents in a cholera outbreak when the brothers were 19. The journey west with nothing but 3 horses and axe, and the stubborn conviction that somewhere in the mountains there was land waiting for men willing to work it. And Lena told them her stories. The sound of her father's voice reading Greek by candlelight. Her mother's hands always moving, always mending, always building something from nothing. The hymns they sang together on Sunday mornings in that small clapboard church where the offering plate held more prayers than pennies. She told them about the books she had loved, the languages she had learned, the questions she had asked that no one in Boston had thought a woman should be asking. And they listened. Not politely, not indulgently. They listened the way people listen when they recognize something of themselves in the speaker. When the words coming out of a stranger's mouth match words they have carried in their own hearts without knowing how to say them. One evening after the children's toys were finished and the harmonica was quiet and the fire had burned down to a deep, steady glow, Colton reached across the space between his chair and hers and took her hand. His calloused fingers closed around hers, and the warmth of his grip traveled through her skin and settled somewhere beneath her ribs. "I did not ride through that blizzard for the horse," he said. Lena looked at him. "I rode through it because I could not bear the thought of you being alone on this mountain if something went wrong. I rode because somewhere in the last few weeks your safety became more important to me than my own. And I do not know when that happened. But it did." Lena did not answer with words. She stood from her chair and crossed the 2 steps between them and pressed her forehead against his chest. His arms came around her slowly, carefully, as if he were holding something that might break. But Lena was not breaking. She was being assembled. Piece by piece, day by day, this man and his brothers were putting her back together in ways she had not known she was broken. "Actions, not words," he murmured against her hair. "That is what a good man does." Harlan watched from across the room with his arms folded, and in his eyes there was not jealousy, but a quiet, settled certainty. What belonged to one of them belonged to all. What one of them felt, the others felt in their own way. This was how they had loved Ruth. This was how they were learning to love Lena. Not divided into thirds, but multiplied by 3. And Emmett, sitting by the window with his harmonica resting on his knee, watched the firelight play across Lena's hair and felt something inside him that had been frozen for 8 years begin slowly and painfully and irreversibly to thaw. But the hardest part was still ahead, because when Philip Ashford rode up that mountain with armed men at his back, he would not be the only one forced to answer for the past. Silas Darrow's secret was about to surface. Ruth's diary was about to speak from beyond the grave, and the truth it carried would either bind this family together forever or shatter it beyond repair. Philip Ashford came with the first thaw, The snow had been retreating for days, pulling back from the clearings, loosening its grip on the south-facing slopes where the sun hit longest. Brown earth showed through in patches like old bruises surfacing beneath pale skin. Somewhere beneath the frozen creek, water had begun to move again. The mountain was waking up. And with the thaw came the sound Lena had been dreading since the morning Cormac Voss had cut the ropes from her wrists and ridden away with a promise that it was not over. She was standing at the cabin window when she heard the horses. Not one horse, many. The sound carried up the trail in a low, steady drum beat that grew louder with every passing second, and Lena felt the blood leave her face before she even saw the first rider break through the tree line. 6 of them. 6 riders on the trail moving in a column, their shapes dark against the white and brown patchwork of the melting snow. Philip Ashford rode at the front. She recognized him even at distance by the way he sat his horse tall and stiff and certain, the posture of a man who believed the world owed him deference and was perpetually offended that it did not deliver. He wore a black overcoat that must have cost more than everything in the Braddock cabin combined. A city hat sat on his head, absurd against the wilderness. Behind him rode Cormac Voss, and behind Voss 4 men Lena did not recognize. Hired guns. They carried rifles across their saddles with the casual ease of men who had used them before and expected to use them again. "He is here," Lena said. Her voice was steady, but her hands resting on the swell of her belly were shaking. Colton was beside her in 2 strides. He looked through the window, counted the riders, and his face became stone. Harlan, Emmett. The brothers materialized from different corners of the cabin. No one needed to explain. They had prepared for this. Rifles were taken from the rack above the door. Ammunition was distributed with the silent efficiency of men who had rehearsed the motions in their minds 100 times. Colton turned to Lena. His amber eyes were calm, and that calm frightened her more than any display of rage could have. It was the calm of a man who had already decided what he was willing to do and what he was willing to lose. "Go to the back room. Take the pistol Harlan gave you. Do not come out unless I call for you." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told her this was not a moment for argument. She took the pistol from the shelf, checked that it was loaded the way Harlan had taught her, and went to the back room. She left the door open a crack. She would hear everything, even if she could not see it. The brothers stepped onto the porch. 3 men, 3 rifles. The timber boards creaked under their combined weight. They stood shoulder to shoulder, and from the trail below, looking up, they must have appeared like a wall built from muscle and stone, and the absolute refusal to give ground. Ashford brought his horse to a stop 30 yards from the cabin. He dismounted slowly, making a show of brushing trail dust from his coat, taking his time establishing that he was a man who could not be rushed. His hired men stayed mounted, hands near their weapons. "So this is where my ward has been hiding," Ashford said. His voice carried clearly in the cold air. It was a voice accustomed to boardrooms and courthouses oiled and precise. "Living like an animal with savages. State your business and leave." Colton's tone carried nothing, no emotion, no invitation. "My business is Lena Prescott. She is my legal ward. She was taken from my care without permission, and I have come to retrieve what belongs to me. She is not property. She is our wife." Ashford's laugh was short and sharp like the bark of a dog. "Your wife, show me the certificate. Show me the legal document that gives any of you a claim to this girl." Silence. They had no certificate. They had married in their hearts in their cabin in the sight of God and no one else. But paper was what Ashford understood, and paper was what they did not have. "That is what I thought," Ashford said, and his smile was the smile of a man who has played this game before and knows exactly how it ends. "Lena, come out. You will return with me to Boston. We will be married as planned, and this unfortunate episode will be forgotten." Lena stepped out of the cabin. She had not planned to. Colton had told her to stay hidden, but something in Ashford's voice, that same old certainty, that same proprietary tone he had used in his house on Beacon Hill when he told her what she owed him, ignited something in her chest that burned hotter than fear. She stood on the porch between Colton and Harlan, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, and looked down at the man who had kept her in a cage for 2 years. "I will not go with you," she said. "Not today, not ever." Ashford's eyes dropped to her stomach. The blood drained from his face, And what replaced it was not surprise, but a fury so cold it had no heat in it at all. "You let these animals defile you," he said. "They are my husbands, and this child is wanted and loved in ways you could never understand." "Take her," Ashford said to his men. His voice had gone tight and thin. "Use force if necessary." The four hired guns began to dismount. The Braddock brothers raised their rifles. Three barrels leveled at four men, and the mathematics of the moment shifted. "The first man who touches her dies," Colton said. He said it the way another man might say the sun rises in the east. A fact. Immovable. Beyond discussion. For a long, terrible moment, the world balanced on a knife edge. The hired men looked at the rifles. They looked at the three giants behind them. They looked at each other and tried to calculate whether Philip Ashford's money was worth dying on a mountain in Colorado for a woman they had never met. Then a voice came from the tree line, low and rough and certain. "I would not do that if I were you, Ashford." Silas Darrow stepped out of the pines. His rifle was leveled at Ashford's chest. His pale eyes, the same eyes that had watched Lena on the stagecoach, with such cold attention, were now locked on the man from Boston with the steady focus of a hunter sighting prey. Behind Silas came Jedediah Cobb, the storekeeper from Stone Creek, carrying a shotgun that looked like it had been in his family since the Revolution. And behind Jed came three other men from town, ranchers and tradesmen, men who had watched the Braddock brothers live quiet and honest lives on their mountain for years, and had decided when word came of trouble that neighbors were neighbors, regardless of how a man arranged his household. "I've been doing some investigating," Silas said, "since your man Voss came through to town last month asking questions about Miss Prescott." He did not look at the brothers. He kept his eyes on Ashford. "Turns out Philip Ashford has quite a history. 3 previous wards, all of them young women, all of them conveniently married to you right after they came into their inheritance. 2 of those women died within a year of the wedding. Mysterious circumstances." The color left Ashford's face entirely. "You have no proof," he said, but the oil had gone out of his voice. "I have enough to make the territorial marshal very interested. And I have this." Silas produced a folded document from inside his coat. "A sworn statement from your former housekeeper in Boston. Mrs. Cartwright remembers quite a lot. The bruises, the locked doors, the days without food. She was happy to put it all in writing when she learned someone was finally asking." Jed Cobb spoke then, his weathered voice carrying the weight of community authority. "We also checked the legal records, Ashford. Miss Prescott turned 21 several weeks ago. Your guardianship is terminated. You have no legal claim to her, not as a ward, not as a bride, not as anything. 21. The words hit Lena like sunlight breaking through cloud. She was free. The guardianship that had been a chain around her ankle for 4 years was over. Ashford had no legal right to her, no claim, no power. The law, which had been his weapon for so long, had quietly turned in her favor while she was not looking. Ashford's composure shattered. He blustered. He threatened. He invoked debts and contracts in the name of every lawyer he knew. But his hired men were already lowering their weapons. The mathematics had changed again, and 4 guns against 7 was not a calculation any sensible man would make. Colton stepped to the edge of the porch. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Leave this territory," he said, "and do not come back, because if you do, if you ever come near our wife again, we will bring you into these mountains, and you will simply disappear. No witness, no grave, no one will ever find you, and no one will look." The certainty in his voice was absolute. It was the voice of a man who meant every syllable and who had the means and the will to make good on every word. Ashford looked into those amber eyes and saw his death written there as clearly as a name carved into stone. Not a threat, a prophecy. The kind of certainty that belongs to mountains and rivers and men who have already made peace with the consequences of their actions. Whatever pride or rage or avarice had driven Philip Ashford up this mountain, it was not enough. It was not enough to stand against 3 men who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. It was not enough to counter the quiet solidarity of frontier neighbors who had ridden up a frozen trail because that was what neighbors did. And it was not enough to overcome the simple, irreducible fact that Lena Prescott had stopped being his property the moment she stepped off that stagecoach 3 months ago, and no piece of paper or hired gun or legal fiction could put her back in the cage he had built. Ashford mounted his horse. He did not look at Lena. He did not look at the brothers. He looked straight ahead at the trail going down, and something in his posture told Lena that the man riding away was smaller than the man who had arrived. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. Cormac Voss followed. He glanced back once, and in that glance, Lena thought she saw something she had never expected to see from the man who had been her jailer. Not regret exactly, but the dull recognition of a man who has backed the wrong horse and knows it. The hired guns went after them, eager to be gone from a mountain that had proved considerably more hostile than the paycheck had suggested. Lena watched until the last rider disappeared around the bend in the trail and the sound of hooves faded to nothing. The valley below was quiet. A hawk circled overhead in wide, lazy spirals, indifferent to the drama that had played out beneath it. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the night she fled Beacon Hill. But the reckoning was not over. It had barely begun. Silas Darrow turned to face the brothers. His rifle was lowered now, hanging loose at his side, and something had changed in his bearing. The predatory stillness was gone. In its place was something Lena had never seen in those pale eyes before. Weariness. And beneath the weariness, guilt so deep it had become the man's foundation, the thing everything else was built upon. "You have questions for me," Silas said. "Starting with why you helped us," Harlan said. His voice was a blade. "You were never our friend." Silas did not flinch. He took a breath that seemed to require all the strength he had. "No," he said, "I was not." He looked at the ground, at the snow melting in patches around his boots, at the mountain that had kept his secret for 8 years. "I loved Ruth," he said. "From the first time I saw her at the general store the summer her family arrived. She was standing behind the counter sorting bolts of fabric, and she looked up when I walked in and smiled. That smile broke something in me, or maybe it fixed something. I was never sure which." His voice was flat now, drained of inflection, as if the telling of this story was costing him everything he had left, and he could not afford to spend any of it on emotion. "I loved her with everything I had. I asked her to marry me. She said no. She said she had already given her heart to 3 men. I could not understand it, could not accept it. A woman like Ruth with a laugh like sunshine and hands that could make anything grow shared between 3 men, like a plow horse passed from field to field. It was wrong, that was what I told myself. It was wrong, and I was the only one who could see it." He paused, swallowed. The sound was audible in the silence. "I followed her that morning, Christmas Eve. 8 years ago, I came to the clearing while you were in the barn tending the horses. She was gathering wood near the tree line, singing to herself, and the snow was coming down soft and straight, and she looked like something out of a painting, like something holy." Silas closed his eyes. "I begged her to leave you, to come away with me. I told her I could give her a proper life, a proper marriage, one husband, one hearth, the way God intended." He opened his eyes and they were wet, and Lena realized with a shock that she had never imagined this hard, cold man capable of tears. "She refused. She told me she loved you, all 3 of you, that her heart was not divided between you but multiplied by you, that what you had built together was the truest thing she had ever known, and she would not leave it. Not for me, not for anyone." His voice cracked like a branch breaking under too much snow. Something in me snapped. I grabbed her. We struggled. My hands were around her throat and she fell, hit the back of her head on a stone hidden beneath the snow. I stood there and watched her stop breathing, watched the snow settle on her hair and her closed eyes, and then I walked away. I left her there in the white, and I went home, and I sat in my cabin and stared at the wall and told myself it was an accident, that I had not meant it, that the fall killed her, not my hands. He looked at Colton, but I knew, I always knew, and I have carried it every day for 8 years, every morning when I woke up and every night when I tried to sleep. Her face, the way the snow settled on her eyelashes, the sound she made when she hit the ground. I have not slept through a single night since that morning. Not one. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Lena had ever heard. Colton moved. He moved with a speed that should not have been possible for a man his size, closing the distance between himself and Silas in 2 strides, his right fist connecting with Darrow's jaw with a sound like a hammer striking oak. Silas went down hard, sprawling in the mud, and melting snow blood spraying from his mouth. Harlan and Emmett caught Colton before his second blow could land. They held him their combined strength barely enough to contain the fury that was pouring out of him like water from a shattered dam. "You killed her." The words tore from Colton's throat, raw and ragged and terrible. "You killed Ruth, and you let us blame ourselves. For 8 years, we carried that guilt every single day. We thought we failed her. We thought if we had gone with her, if we had not let her walk out that door, she would still be alive. And you let us believe that. You let us eat ourselves alive with it." Silas lay in the mud. Blood ran from his split lip. He made no effort to rise. "I know," he said. "I came here today to confess, to make it right before the guilt finishes what it started. I deserve whatever you want to do to me." Colton stood over him, shaking his fists clenched so tight the tendons stood out like cables on the backs of his hands. Lena could see it in his body, the violence coiling, the decision being made and unmade, and made again in the space between heartbeats. Then Emmett spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through Colton's rage the way a scalpel cuts through fever. "Ruth would not want this." Colton did not move. "She would not want more blood on this mountain. She would not want you to become the thing that killed her. If you do this, if you take his life, you are a murderer, and that is not Ruth's legacy. That is not what she died for." The silence stretched. A bird sang somewhere in the pines, oblivious and bright. Slowly, so slowly it seemed to cost him everything he had. Colton's fists unclenched. His hands opened finger by finger, and the violence drained out of him like color draining from a winter sky. He looked at Jed Cobb. "Take him to the marshal. Let the law handle it." Then Lena stepped forward. She had been standing on the porch through all of it, watching, holding her silence, waiting for the right moment. And now that moment had arrived. She reached inside her coat and pulled out two objects: a small, leather-bound journal and a single folded letter yellowed with age. "You will need these," she said, handing them to Jed. Ruth kept a diary. The final entries describe a man who stalked her, threatened her, grabbed her in the weeks before she died. She does not name him, but the details leave no doubt. She held up the letter. "And this is a letter from Silas Darrow to Ruth dated 3 weeks before her murder. A written threat. Physical evidence." The brothers stared at her. Colton's voice was hoarse. "You knew." "I found the diary weeks ago," Lena said, "hidden under a false bottom in Ruth's sewing basket. I wanted to tell you. Every day I wanted to tell you. But I knew what you would do. I knew you would ride down that mountain and kill Silas with your bare hands, and I could not let that happen. Not when I had just found you. Not when I was carrying your child." She met his eyes and did not look away. "I waited for the right moment. And then Ashford came, and everything happened at once. I'm sorry I kept it from you. But I was protecting you, even from yourselves." For a long moment, Colton simply looked at her. His eyes were red. His face was wet. His massive body was trembling with the aftershocks of everything he had just felt and everything he was feeling now. Then he crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. He held her against his chest, and his body shook not with anger, but with relief. 8 years of guilt, explained at last. 8 years of believing he had failed the woman he loved, lifted off his shoulders by a truth that was terrible, but also in its own way merciful. He had not failed Ruth. He had been robbed of her. And there was a difference between those two things that was as wide as the scornbone. "You protected us," he whispered into her hair. "You protected us even from ourselves." Jed and his men led Silas Darrow away. The old trapper walked between them without resistance, his head bowed, his steps slow. At the edge of the clearing, he turned back one last time. "For what it is worth," he said, "I am sorry. Ruth deserved better, and so does your wife. Protect her. Do not let the past poison what you have." They watched until the group disappeared down the trail, and the sound of footsteps faded into the quiet of the mountain. Then Colton dropped to his knees in the snow. 8 years of grief broke free at once, not the controlled grief of a man holding himself together for the sake of others. The raw, wholesale collapse of a heart that had been carrying a weight it was never meant to bear. He wept the way storms weep, without restraint, without dignity, without concern for who was watching. Harlan knelt beside him. Emmett knelt on the other side. They held each other, the three of them, and they mourned Ruth openly and fully for the first time since they had put her in the ground on the hill beneath the aspens. Lena stood on the porch and let her own tears fall. She understood with a clarity that ached that this was not just justice for Ruth. This was liberation for all of them. The guilt that had hollowed these three men and haunted this cabin for nearly a decade was finally dissolving. And what it left behind was not emptiness, but space. Space to love without apology. Space to build without the shadow of failure darkening every board they nailed and every fence they mended. When they came inside at last, their eyes were red but clear. Clearer than Lena had ever seen them. Colton pulled her close, his hands settling on her belly where their child was growing, and spoke words that gathered up every broken thing and made it whole. "Ruth is at peace now," he said, "and so am I. This is where you belong, Lena. That life is over. Winter always ends. And what we have now, we built with our own hands." The days that followed were quiet in the way the world is quiet after a storm has passed, and the air is washed clean, and the light falls differently on familiar things. Lena cooked while Colton repaired the fence the winter had broken. She stood at the stove making venison stew, the cabin filling, with the smell of onion and saw and slow simmered meat, and through the window she watched him work. He moved with the unhurried precision of a man who respected his materials. Each post set plumb, each rail notched clean. He worked the way he loved, steadily, thoroughly, without wasted motion or unnecessary words. Harlan split wood with a rhythm that was steady and even, no longer carrying the compressed fury that had once turned every swing into a controlled act of violence. The sound of his axe was metronomic now, almost peaceful. Thwack, thwack, thwack. A sound that had become the heartbeat of the homestead, as reliable as the sunrise and as constant as the creek running behind the barn. Emmett played his harmonic on the porch in the afternoons, and the songs were no longer sad. They were not quite joyful either. They were something in between, something that acknowledged the weight of the past while reaching cautiously towards something lighter. The sound drifted across the clearing and into the trees, and more than once Lena saw Colton pause in his work and turn his head to listen, his eyes closed, his face still. Small moments, precious ones. The kind of moments that are invisible while they are happening and become priceless only in retrospect, when you look back across the years and realize those were the days when the foundation was being laid. Lena and Colton sitting on the porch at sunset, shoulders touching, watching the light turn the snow to orange and gold, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers keeping their distance. It was the silence of two people who had run out of things they needed to prove to each other and could simply be still. Harlan, returning from a walk one afternoon with a fistful of early wildflowers, the first of the season, purple and yellow, still half frozen at the stems. He set them in a tin cup on the kitchen table without a word and went back outside. He did not look at Lena when he did it. He did not need to. The flowers said everything. Emmett resting his hand on the small of Lena's back as she passed him in the cabin, a gesture so natural and habitual it might have belonged to people who had known each other for decades rather than months. It was not possessive. It was not demanding. It was a touchstone, a way of saying without language, "I am here, and so are you, and that is enough." One evening, Lena took Ruth's unfinished embroidery from the sewing basket. The cover for the cedar cross worked in blue and gold thread, a pattern of vines and leaves that Ruth's skilled hands had been creating when death interrupted the work forever. "I would like to finish this," Lena said, "if that would be all right." Emmett's eyes went bright. He nodded. She would have liked that. Lena worked on it through the week. Her stitches were not as fine as Ruth's. Her hands did not have the same gift. But they were careful and respectful, and when she fitted the finished cover over the small cedar cross beside the window, all four of them stood together and looked at it in silence. Ruth's work and Lena's joined. The past and the present stitched together with thread the color of sky and gold. Colton asked her on a morning in late March when the snow was retreating fast and the creek behind the cabin had thawed enough to sing. "Lena, I want to marry you properly. A real ceremony. A real certificate. All three of us." She smiled through tears she had not felt coming. "I already have you. But yes, let us make it legal." They rode down to Stone Creek together on a day when the sky was so blue it looked like something God had made fresh that morning. The circuit judge was visiting a lean, weathered man with sharp eyes who had seen enough of frontier life to know that the rules back east did not always apply in the territories. Legally, Lena could marry only one of them. She chose Colton the eldest, but the vows she spoke were for all three, and every soul in Stone Creek who had gathered in the little church with the leaning steeple understood that. The town came to celebrate. These frontier people had their own ideas about how a life should be lived, and most of those ideas had been shaped by hardship and survival, and the understanding that a person's worth was measured by what they built, not by what society approved of. If three brothers wanted to share a wife, and the wife stood between them, with her chin lifted and her voice steady, and a child growing in her belly, then who were they to say it was wrong? Lena wore a white dress that Emmett had sewn for her, altered at the waist to accommodate the gentle curve of new life. She stood between her three husbands and spoke words of love and fidelity that she had never been more certain of in her life. That evening, back in the cabin, the fire burning high and the cradle waiting in the corner, each section carved by a different brother from the same piece of cedar wood, Lena lay surrounded by the warmth of the three men who had chosen her. The door was closed against the night. The mountain held them all in its vast, indifferent embrace. And Lena Prescott Braddock felt complete peace, no fear, no listening for footsteps in the hallway, no calculating the distance to the nearest door. Only warmth, only safety, only the steady breathing of three men who loved her, and the quiet certainty that this was where she belonged. "This is where you belong." Colton murmured the words against her hair, and this time they were not a promise. They were a fact, settled and permanent as the mountain itself. The seasons turned. Spring came with a rush of green, so sudden it seemed like the mountain had been holding its breath all winter and finally let it out. Lena planted a garden behind the cabin. Potatoes, carrots, beans. She pushed seeds into dark earth with her own hands and felt something ancient and right in the act of it, this partnership between a woman and the ground. Colton built a new fence around the garden, straight and strong, sunk deep enough that no animal could root beneath it. Harlan broke two more wild horses that spring, adding them to the ranch string. His wild energy finally matched to work that could absorb it. Emmett gathered fresh herbs from the mountainside, elderberry, and yarrow and willow bark, replenishing the supplies Ruth had first established, and Lena was now learning to maintain. In late October of 1878, on a cold morning when frost painted the windows in patterns that looked like fern leaves pressed in ice, Lena's labor began. It was long and it was hard. Emmett served as midwife, his large hands suddenly gentle beyond imagining, his voice calm and steady as a creek bed. Colton held Lena's hand and let her crush his fingers with every contraction. His face white, his jaw set, absorbing her pain the only way he could. Harlan paced the main room like a caged animal, terrified and useless and unable to stop himself. The baby came as the sun was setting. A boy, small and red and furious, with a cry that filled the cabin from wall to wall. Emmett laid him on Lena's chest, and his own eyes were streaming. "A son," he said. "We have a son." The boy had fine brown hair, and when he opened his eyes for the first time, squinting against the firelight, they were amber, like whiskey held to flame. There was no way to know which brother had fathered him, and it did not matter. He belonged to all of them. "Asa," Lena said. "His name is Asa." 2 years later, a daughter, Nell. Hair like honey, eyes like cornflowers, her mother made small and perfect. The cabin grew. New rooms were added log by log, each one raised by 6 hands. 2 years after that, on a December night when the snow fell thick and the fire burned hot, and Lena laughed until she cried because this time there were 2 of them twin boys arrived. Identical from their first breath. They named them Colton Jr., called Kit, and Harlan Jr., called Holt. The cabin grew again. Word came in the 2nd year that Philip Ashford had died of a fever in Boston. His estate was found to be largely fraudulent, his debts exceeding his assets by a factor of 10. The man who had held Lena captive had been building his empire on sand, and when he fell, no one mourned him. Silas Darrow received 10 years in the territorial prison. Lena felt no satisfaction when she heard the sentence. Only a quiet, clean relief, like setting down a burden she had been carrying so long she had forgotten its weight. The ranch prospered. The herd grew. The Braddock name became known in the territory not for its strangeness, but for its reliability. When a neighbor needed help raising a barn, the Braddock brothers showed up with tools and muscle and stayed until the job was done. When a woman in Stone Creek had a difficult birth, it was Lena they sent for with her steady hands and her knowledge of herbs and her calm voice that could talk a frightened mother through the worst of it. There were hard years too. The winter of 1884 was the worst anyone could remember, a season of blizzards that stacked one atop another like layers of stone, burying the high country under 6 feet of snow and killing cattle from Stone Creek to the Dakota line. The Braddock Ranch lost a third of its herd. Lena rationed food until the children grew thin and the brothers grew quiet. But they survived. They survived because they had been built, all four of them, for this kind of endurance. Because they had stared down worse things than weather and won. And when the spring came that year, late and grudging, and the first green shoots pushed through the mud where the snow had been, Emmett said what they were all thinking. Winter always ends. And they rebuilt. Again. The way they always did. They were woven into the fabric of the community. Not despite their arrangement, but alongside it. The people of Stone Creek had learned the way frontier people do, that survival makes its own morality, and a family held together by love and labor and mutual devotion was a family worth respecting, no matter how many husbands stood at the table. Built with our own hands. The phrase had become more than words. It was the ranch and the garden and the 4 children and the life that grew around them like a tree growing around a fence post, absorbing it, making it part of itself. 20 years passed. They passed the way 20 years would always pass when you are living inside them. One day at a time, so slowly you do not notice the accumulation until you look up one afternoon and realize that the children who were crawling across the cabin floor are now taller than you are, and the man whose hair was dark as chestnuts now wears silver at his temples, and the woman you married has lines around her eyes that were not there when she stepped off that stagecoach. And every single one of those lines was put there by laughter. Lena stood on the porch one autumn evening in 1898 watching the sun go down behind the peaks. She was 41 years old. Her honey blonde hair held threads of silver now gathered at her nape, the way frontier women wore it practical. And out of the way, though tendrils still escaped around her temples in the old habit that had never quite been tamed. Her hands, once pale and soft with Boston keeping, were brown and roughened from 20 years of frontier work. They were hands that had delivered children, both her own and her neighbors. Hands that had planted gardens and kneaded bread and held a dying calf through the night and stitched a quilt that now hung beside the one Ruth had made the two of them side by side on the cabin wall. Different hands, different years, the same home. Lines had gathered at the corners of her eyes put there by laughter and wind, and the particular squint of a woman who has spent 2 decades watching the horizon for weather and trouble and the sight of her children coming home. She had never been more beautiful. The brothers told her so, and she believed them because the way they looked at her had not diminished by so much as a degree in all the years since she had stepped off that stagecoach into nothing. Colton was 55. His hair was more silver than brown now, and the lines in his face had deepened into the permanent topography of a man who had spent his life outdoors. But he was still strong, still vital, still the steady center around which the rest of them orbited. Harlan at the same age had silver at his temples, but a body that was still hard as the granite outcroppings on the high ridge. He had mellowed somewhat. The wildness had not left him, but it had found its channels directed now into the work of the ranch and the fierce protective love he bore for his children. Emmett still played his harmonica every evening after supper. His voice was still the gentlest in the house. His hands still healed whatever needed healing. Asa was 20, tall and broad, already showing the massive frame he had inherited from his fathers. He worked the ranch with the same quiet competence Colton had taught him, and there was talk of him courting a girl from a homestead in the next valley. Nell was 18, beautiful and sharp-tongued and kind, with her mother's blue eyes and a mind that could not be contained by any boundary anyone tried to set around it. She was engaged to Jed Cobb's youngest son, and the wedding was planned for spring. The twins Kit and Holt were 16. Identical terrors. They had inherited every ounce of Harlan's wild energy and none of his hard-won restraint, and they kept the entire household in a state of cheerful chaos that Lena would not have traded for anything in the world. Colton came to stand behind her on the porch, his arms wrapped around her waist in the gesture that had become as natural and necessary as breathing. She leaned back against his chest. Inside the cabin, she could hear the children laughing, the clink of dishes, Emmett's harmonica starting up a tune that Harlan was already humming along to. "Happy?" Colton asked. More than I ever thought possible, Lena said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Harlan and Emmett joined them on the porch, and the four of them stood together watching the last light of autumn paint the first snow of the season in shades of amber and rose. The mountains stretched above them, vast and patient and eternal, and the valley below was filled with the evidence of the life they had built. Fences straight and strong, a garden put to bed for winter, a barn full of healthy stock, a cabin that had grown from a small shelter into a true home, its walls thick with warmth and memory. Lena thought of Mother Superior Agnes, who had sent her west with a lie that became truth. She thought of Ruth, whose ghost had finally found peace in the stitching of an embroidered cross cover and the justice of a confession spoken aloud. She thought of the girl she had been terrified and alone stepping off a stagecoach on Christmas Eve into a situation that should have been impossible. That girl had been brave enough to leap into the unknown, to trust three strangers with her heart and her future, to choose the untested over the unbearable, to believe that somewhere in the vast wilderness of the world, there might be a place where she was wanted and valued and loved, not for what she could give, but for who she was. That bravery had given her everything. The mountain held them all in its eternal embrace. The snow fell softly, the fire burned in the hearth, the children's laughter drifted through the cabin walls like music, and Lena Prescott Braddock, wife to three brothers, mother to four children, the woman who had taught broken men to love again, closed her eyes and let the peace of this moment settle over her like a quilt stitched by two pairs of hands across the divide of years. She still remembered stepping off that stagecoach into nothing. 20 years later, standing on the porch that Colton had built with his own hands, listening to her grandchildren chase each other through the last wildflowers of the season, she thought that was the day my life began. The snow kept falling, the fire kept burning, the family kept breathing, and somewhere in the vast Colorado wilderness, in a home that four people had built against every odd and every obstacle, and every voice that told them it could not be done, a woman who had once had nothing now had absolutely everything. If you enjoyed this story, I would be honored if you would subscribe. I share new frontier stories every week. And leave a comment to tell me where you are listening from tonight. Next week, a new story from these mountains. A widow with a young son, two brothers, and the worst blizzard in 30 years. I will see you then.